Hello, everyone. My name is Frank. I'm part of the Cal State Fullerton chapter of the Psi Chi International Society for Psychology Students. I'll be introducing the panelists for tonight's discussion, but first I would like to give two thanks. I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight to see this debate this evening. I'm sure you're going to have a wonderful time, and you'll be telling your children about it for many years to come. I'd also like to thank the organizers for allowing Psi Chi to have the honor of hosting tonight's event. So before I introduce these legends of academia, these mavericks of modern thought, I'm going to ask all of you to please hold your applause until we meet all of them. So Brittany Page and Jesse Dollemore, they are the hosts of the twice-weekly news and comments program called I Doubt It with Dollemore. You can find it anywhere you find podcasts. They will be moderating tonight's discussion and making sure that it does not turn into too much of a bloodbath. Dr. Michael Shermer, the gentleman right in the middle, is the founder of the Skeptics Society, the creator of Skeptics Magazine, and a presidential fellow at Chapman University, where he teaches, you guessed it, Skepticism 101. He is the author of several New York Times bestsellers, such as Why People Believe Weird Things, The Science of Good and Evil, and most recently, The Moral Arc. He is also an alumnus of Cal State Fullerton. In fact, he is a former student of Dr. Douglas Navarick, the gentleman on the left. Dr. Navarick is an experimental psychologist and a professor at Cal State Fullerton. He has published a couple of well-known articles in Skeptic Magazine, including The God Construct and The Three Shades of Atheism. His current research focuses on how behavioral processes influence our choices. Specifically, he examines how people make complex moral decisions based on their intuitions, and how an action can feel so right yet so wrong at the same time, creating a sense of moral ambivalence. Dr. Ryan Nichols, the gentleman on the right, is a professor of philosophy at Cal State Fullerton, who believes that most scholarly introductions function to prime audiences to induce them to commit fallacies of authority. I believe that's some philosophy humor. It kind of goes over my head. He is, suffice to say, he has a PhD, he has edited a couple of books, and he has held some academic research fellowships. He is an interdisciplinary researcher. He is a full-time, currently enrolled student at Cal State Fullerton, and he is not really sure what he is an expert of. He loves Gus Grissom Park, the John Templeton Foundation, but he does not claim to represent their views tonight. And he really enjoys riding motorcycles and learning new things. Now, before I pass it along to the moderators, let's give them all a big round of applause.
So first of all, because we are super professional, let me turn their mics on and give them to them.
That's important.
It's not usually this ceremonious. There you go. One for you. And
Should I narrate since this is also going to be a podcast?
that's right. So this is being broadcast, or will be broadcast on a podcast. I want to thank everybody for coming out. Thank you so much. This is an overwhelming turnout. I'm super thrilled. If there is a seat next to you and someone needs that seat, and if that seat's not reserved legitimately, not for your purse or your coat, let's get cozy. Let's get friendly and get to know one another. It's going to be a good night. So if you're in the back, you want a seat, raise your hand if there's a seat next to you that needs to be filled. Yeah, and there's the floor too. No lighters. All right. Well, good. Other than that, is that it?
So we're going to be passing this mic back and forth, and that's important to note for the podcast as well, because you have to talk into it to hear. Okay. So our basic question tonight is the following. What is the role of science in helping us understand what is right and wrong? Or does science even have a role? The panel will debate claims in recent books that science has, in fact, discovered objective moral principles, absolute principles that would point in the direction of true virtue on anyone's moral compass, and that this has been accomplished purely within a naturalistic framework, without the assumption of any divine creator or guidance by any religious ideology or philosophy. Dr. Shermer is the author of one of these books, The Moral Arc, which will be our focus this evening, along with his recent article in the journal Theology and Science entitled Scientific Naturalism, A Manifesto for Enlightenment and Humanism. Additional books along these lines are The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris and Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature. Our goal tonight is to have a free exchange of ideas among everyone here. That includes the panelists and the audience. So it's really important that during their opening statements, during the exchanges among the panelists, that if something comes to mind that you want to know more about, you make a note in your memory or write it down and be ready to ask a question when that time comes.
All right, so how this is going to work tonight, first we're going to have an opening statement from each of our panelists of up to 10 minutes. I am the bully timekeeper. Gentlemen, there will be a timer there to check, and I will have to go back and grab the little ding bell, or I'll just scream, hey, you got a minute before you're done. They will be answering or taking a position on the following motion: science can determine moral values of right and wrong. Then we're going to set aside a period of about 15 minutes for them to kind of free form, mix it up peacefully, like Frank said, no bloodbath. And following that, there will be a 40-minute question and answer from both knuckleheads like me and wonderful, loving individuals like you at this microphone right here. So there was going to be volunteers from Psi Chi, but we have a stationary mic, so that is not necessary. After the question and answer, to close the discussion, each one of these gentlemen will have 3 minutes, or up to 3 minutes, to give their final statements, including whether or not they have changed their minds about their position that they walked in with.
Oh, I already know I'm not going to.
So, timekeeper, without further ado, we are going to start with Dr. Shermer.
Thank you. So I really appreciate you inviting me here and taking my ideas seriously enough to actually read the book. I'm always amazed when people read my book. I always say when they say, I read your book, so you're the one. So I am grateful for that. And I realized when I was making notes for tonight that this is 40 years ago I entered Doug Navarick's lab to work. And it was Doug who taught me to think as a scientist. And at the time I was an evangelical Christian, and by the time I left his lab I was an atheist. So I'll let you be the judge of whether that was a good thing or not. Or more to the point, if I'm wrong, I guess God can judge us both. All the good people will be there at the other place, you know. My friends Hitch and so on. Anyway, so I'm a moral realist, and I will defend the moral realist position tonight. How do we know what's right and wrong? So I'll start with Abraham Lincoln, who said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And since I wrote a book about the Holocaust, Denying History, I would add to that, if the Holocaust is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And by wrong, I mean really wrong. Not just, in my opinion, it's wrong, or in our Western culture, slavery and the Holocaust were wrong, but in some other culture, it's perfectly good, perfectly just, perfectly justified, or some other moral universe where this would make sense, or it would be logical for all parties involved. So it's my hypothesis that just we could back it with science, so I'm going to start with the physical sciences. And just as Galileo and Newton discovered physical laws and principles about the natural world that are really out there, so too have social scientists discovered natural laws and moral laws that are, well, I don't want to say out there, they're in there. They're in our minds, in our brains, in our human nature. Just as it was inevitable that the astronomer Johannes Kepler would discover that planets have elliptical orbits, given that he was making accurate astronomical measurements and given that planets really do travel in ellipses, he could hardly have discovered anything else. Scientists studying political, economic, social, and moral subjects will discover certain things that are true. For example, democracies are better than autocracies. Market economies are superior to command economies. Torture and death penalty do not curb crime. Burning women as witches is an idiotic idea. Women are too weak and emotional to run companies or countries is also an idiotic idea. And that blacks do not like being slaves and that Jews do not want to be exterminated. Now, why don't blacks want to be slaves? And why don't Jews want to be exterminated? Well, first of all, you can ask them, and they will tell you. Not like, oh, in my opinion, I don't want to be exterminated. I really actually don't want to be exterminated. Really, in a real moral universe as real as elliptical orbits. So the way I derive that is just from human nature. It's in our nature to struggle to survive and flourish and reproduce, that other part of evolution. And that's just part of who we are. It really begins with the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. So sentience is really our grounding point there. And sentient, individual sentient beings. And so I say beings, so it's not just people. Obviously, there's also animals that are sentient, and we should expand our moral considerations to those as well. So any organism subject to natural selection, I argue, is going to have this desire built into its nature to survive and flourish. So it begins with the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. So the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of life, is to push up the gradient of energy to push back against entropy. And you do that as cells by consuming energy from the sun or wherever, and then generating self-replicating molecules. So it really begins with Dawkins' thought experiment of the selfish gene. And this is an unfortunate title because a lot of people read the book by the title and they don't read the book. Genes aren't thinking anything. They're not selfish. Genes are just replicating molecules. But it begins with building a structure that enables you to maintain in perpetuity your existence. And self-replicating molecules that don't self-replicate to do that don't survive. So the genes are immortal. The bodies that house the genes are mortal. And so it's their goal, as it were. It's their telos, their ultimate purpose in life is to push back against entropy, go up the energy gradient. And by doing that, you have to consume energy and get resources and so on. Now, it could be that the best thing you can do is to always be selfish in a behavioral way and consume all the resources around you, including the other self-replicating molecules in their bodies. The problem is they're going to make the same calculation as you, and you could be consumed by them. So oftentimes, the most selfish thing you can do is to be cooperative, to be altruistic, to be reciprocally altruistic, to be to sort of practice non-zero win-win exchanges with other survival machines. And in that way, the best way to perpetrate your genes into the future is to be moral. And it's not enough, and by moral, I mean really moral, like you really believe it, you really feel it. And because it's not enough to fake being a cooperator, to pretend to be a good friend, because we've also evolved cheater detection devices. We can tell when somebody's being phony. You know when people are jacking you around and they're not genuine. You know when somebody's a genuine friend. We're good at this. And so my argument is that evolution vouchsafed to us emotions in which we feel real moral consideration for others. I mean, not always. We have inner demons and better angels that are always in competition, but the problem of evil is a slightly different one. So from there, then we can build the idea that there's real moral emotions. These emotions that we have, emotions evolved as proxies to drive behavior, to get organisms to behave in a certain way. Or consider this analogy from mathematics made by the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, that moral truths, they don't instantiate like the mass of a particle or the the gravitational pull of a planet. But they're more like Platonic truths that most scientists agree exist. For example, from Pinker. On this analogy, we're born with a rudimentary concept of number, but as soon as we build on it with formal mathematical reasoning, the nature of mathematical reality forces us to discover some truth and not others. No one who understands the concept of 2, the concept of 4, and the concept of addition can come to any conclusion but that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Perhaps we're born with a rudimentary moral sense, and as soon as we build on it with moral reasoning, the nature of moral reality forces us to some conclusions but not others. For example, the non-zero exchange between two survival machines naturally leads, once they begin thinking, to reason their way to, instead of me killing you to take your stuff and me worrying about you making the same calculation. I don't mean to point to you because you're a big burly guy, but but you get my point. I'm going to be as worried about you as you're worried about me. So wouldn't it be better if we reasoned our way and said, let's cooperate. I'll give you this and you give me that, and we exchange. And we're both better off being alive than dead. So that's, from there we can start to build moral principles. Now, the details may vary depending on which cultures, but the emotion of feeling guilt or pride or feeling shame or jealousy or whatever, those are culturally independent. They exist in there regardless, like language. You're all going to learn a language. Which one depends on where you're. We can all feel guilty about something, depends on what the culture tells us to feel guilty about. So, now I have to address one more thing here in my last minute, and that is most scientists and philosophers say you can't derive an ought from an is. So I need to address that real quick. When Hume said that, he meant something like, if war is common in nature, hello?
Battery was down.
Okay, battery. Oh boy, I smoked that thing. Some hot words there. So let's say war is natural, it's the way things are, therefore we ought to have wars. No, I don't mean that. I mean the nature of war itself. By understanding its true causes, its nature, then we can figure out what we ought to do to attenuate it. Why ought we to do that? Because we don't want to die. We want to survive and flourish in wars, murders, homicides, and violence, and so forth. It lessens that propensity to be able to survive and flourish. So I think it's one of these memes that's just caught on, and people just repeat it. But Hume. But if you read Hume, he says you have to have a reason for making that shift from is to ought. So to that I say, Mr. Hume, tear down this wall.
All right, Dr. Navarick, taking your position on the motion, science can determine moral values of right and wrong.
Okay, well, first let me say that I'm really thrilled to have this chance to share ideas that I've been incubating over the last few years. They seem to be crystallizing now. On that question, I would say, basically, I disagree that science can answer our questions about right and wrong. But I would also say I agree. And I disagree if we dogmatically rule out any possibility that science can investigate possible supernatural influences on natural processes, as assumed by scientific naturalism. However, I agree that science can help us determine objective and absolute moral values if we are prepared to keep an open mind and follow the evidence wherever it leads. As a starting point, we need to come to grips with the understanding that nature in itself has no moral content to it. If you see yourself as a part of nature, and if you believe that nature is all there is, then nothing we do is right or wrong. It just is. And you can see the implications of being consistent. If we consider the most recent horror, the shooting in Las Vegas, would you say that hurricanes Marie, Irma, Harvey did anything wrong? Well, if you're consistent, you would also have to say that the shooter in Las Vegas did nothing wrong. These were all just destructive acts of nature without any moral content to them. And yes, it feels different, but our moral feelings and our sentiments and what we say about them in naturalistic terms are just natural processes in themselves. Yes, the shooter differed from the hurricanes in that the shooter had the intention to kill. But that's a distinction without a difference. Because in psychology, intention would be a construct that represents a cognitive process. And cognitive processes are viewed in psychology as natural processes that follow principles of cause and effect. So the intentions of the shooter were caused and can be understood, just as the directions taken by these hurricanes were caused and can be understood. To see the problems of assuming science can tell us what is right and wrong, let's apply some principles proposed by Michael and the atheistic author Sam Harris to the question of abortion. And specifically, does a fetus have any moral claim to protection from abortion? Now, Michael's basic principle that he maintains science has discovered is that we're obligated to maximize the flourishing and survival of sentient beings. And Sam Harris has a similar principle, that we need to maximize the well-being of conscious creatures. So consciousness or sentience are said to be basic moral considerations. So what would that imply for the moral rights of a fetus? By the age of 7 months, probably they would have the capacity for consciousness based on patterns of brain waves across their two halves of the cortex. Sentience could begin earlier, about 5 months. So if we applied these principles, they would say that the earliest that a fetus would have a moral claim to protection from abortion would be 5 months. And it's said this is a discovery made by science. Science can tell us about the potential for consciousness and sentience in a developing fetus. But can it tell us what the moral rights of a fetus are? Is this a discovery that a 5-month-old fetus has a moral claim to protection, but a 4-month or 3-month-old fetus does not? It's a subjective preference, not a discovery of science. In the Declaration of Independence, an important distinction is made between laws of nature and nature's God. The founders, like other Enlightenment philosophers, were believers in a creator. It wasn't natural laws that gave us our moral rights, but rather the creator of those laws, from which we got our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To get beyond description, to get beyond is in the terminology of the is-ought problem, we need to place a construct of intention before is. In that case, what was intended is and ought to be, and therefore would be an objective moral virtue. On the other hand, what is would not necessarily be intended. In other words, you can't go in the reverse direction. That's the naturalistic fallacy. But if there were some way to conceptualize a process of intent before a natural process, then that natural process would be an objective moral virtue and could provide guidelines for moral judgments. In an article in Skeptic a couple of years ago, I outlined a construct of intention in the framework of the question of how life originated. And I referred to it as a God construct. And I framed the issue of two competing hypotheses. Either life started as a result of random processes, or it started as a result of intention. The evidence actually points more towards intention than towards random processes. But what would be the advantage of considering the possibility that life had a willed origin rather than a random origin? What would be the value added? The value added is that it would give us a basis for inferring objective moral values. Let me illustrate this quickly with the concept of self-actualization, which is fundamental in humanistic theories. So Michael's version of it is to maximize the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. But if life was willed, then the implications would be that the cells that originally emerged would have naturally a propensity to grow, diversify, and fulfill a genetic potential. And that is a fundamental concept in humanistic theory. Carl Rogers' self-actualization, which originates from Kurt Goldstein's concept. And I'll have a few more things to say about self-actualization as our discussion continues.
Thank you, Dr. Navarick. And now it is time for Dr. Nichols to present his position on the resolution, Science Can Determine Moral Values of Right and Wrong.
Thanks. I can't sit still for an hour and a half. I'll just stop now. Never been able to. So I had a couple of points. One is scientific, one is philosophical. First, I really enjoyed Dr. Shermer's book, For Sale out back there. I learned a lot about a lot of different things, exposed to many new studies. Would you allow me to have this pretense that I have a view from nowhere? I might have my own cognitive biases, but I'd rather not show you what those are, and instead just be a free thinker with me for a few minutes about the science and its study of morality. So first point is one in the weeds. I'm going to ask you to follow me through, and then we'll end up on a mountainside with another story at the end of my remarks. So first, Dr. Shermer uses many scientific studies to argue that morality is explicable by science. Many of them are focused on altruism. Many of them are not focused on altruism. So by altruism, as Dr. Shermer illustrated, we're talking about a situation in which individuals are sacrificing themselves or their own interests, their resources, for other people, often strangers. That's sort of the pinnacle of morality. Merely cooperating when it's in my narrow self-interest is something less than that. That's morality light. when it comes to scientific studies of altruism, one stood out from Dr. Shermer's book, Joe Henrich, 2010, in which he shows that hunter-gatherer societies that are present-day hunter-gatherer societies that they found in far-flung corners of the earth tend to be very non-altruistic as compared to modern secular societies. And that's evidence to think that secular government is the best way to morality. So these studies work like this. They use a dictator game. And the version that's at use here, we can work with it in this simplistic way. Imagine that you're given $21 bills, and you're told, these are your $21 bills. There's an anonymous playing partner, and you may give some money to that other person. Anything else, you keep. So researchers then look at how much you give. Turns out that hunter-gatherer societies only give 25% of their dictator game allotment, whereas modern secular societies give as much as 45%. Okay. So a few problems with Dr. Shermer's use of that study and problems with the study are as follows. First, in the book version, at least, Dr. Shermer misquotes the article. And it might be somewhat important that happens. I only read one background article that he used in the book, so I can't tell you what happens with other articles he's using. But that concerned me a bit. Not only that, but the study had 15 groups of 15 small-scale hunter-gatherer scavenger societies, and the study's authors duplicated one set of the data so that they actually ran the version that Dr. Shermer uses was published where 2 of the small-scale societies' data was identical. They copy and pasted over. It happens, I guess, even to the best of them. Now, Joe's at Harvard University, no less. But not noticing the erratum in that study published in Science is a concern when we're still trying to make inferences from that. But more importantly, I suppose, there's some additional information surrounding that study that is of a concern, that may lead to the questions about how the extent to which science can explain morality using economic games. So consider a recent, sort of not exactly a replication, but another dictator game. So these people wanted to do this in a place without much morality in a very secular society, and where else to go but Sin City. They station themselves at the Las Vegas bus station, and they run a dictator game with casino chips, $1 a piece. So one experimenter, Winking and Miser, 2013, if you're curious. So one of them is boarding a bus station. He says, "Excuse me there, ma'am, I got 20 chips here, and you can keep all of them yourself." And afterwards, they simply watch whether she gives these away or not. That's the first study. 0 altruism. Second study. In other words, none of their participants gave any chips to anyone. The second version of the study, very similar, a similar voice to this actor too. "Excuse me there, feller. I got 20 chips right here. I'm leaving town. I can't use them elsewhere, so they're yours. Now look over there yonder, and that man in the phone booth, he might need some." So at that point, they also look at whether or not the person gave any away, and did he? 0. Nothing was given. The third condition, however, was different. In this condition, they went full metal experimentalist on them. So they had them sign an IRB form. They pre-gamed to make sure they understood. They did comprehension checks. They factored for collusion. They had them sign IRB forms. Then maybe they wore a white coat too. Well, doubt it. But you get the point. Now, guess what happens when you approach someone in a Las Vegas bus station and you give them that full experimental treatment?
"Excuse me, we are experimenting on you."
When that happens, they are responsive to the prime. Now they're being watched. And that's the cue to morality, folks. It's morality light, though. That's the difference. So this leads to my second philosophical point. But I want to add, in addition, there's a bunch of evidence about the positive relationship between gods, high gods in particular, and morality in this particular study that Dr. Shermer mentions, but in passing. And I mean, it's really hard to do these studies. There are flaws with the study. It's really hard to write about them. We all have lots of cognitive biases that twist us in ways that we don't even understand. I'm certainly gifted in cognitive biases. But on the other hand, in this case, Dr. Shermer mentions there was a modest effect of world religion. Now, in the hunter-gatherer societies, they had 2 world religions represented, Islam and Christianity. And it turns out that people in Islam and Christianity were very generous, more so than secular people. In addition, there was a market integration, a trading function. That also predicted rates of altruism. Anyway, to the philosophical point. Sorry, I'm rushing, but I have 10 minutes. I can see the clock right here. The philosophical point follows from this. So I'm arguing that morality light, which may often be the subject of what we talk about up here, is something less than morality. Whereas morality is honestly on the inside. So in lots of correlational studies where we look at, so for example, secular societies people in secular societies commit fewer murders than people in non-secular societies. Okay, but notice, is that because they're not committing murders because they're really truly moral people? Well, there's a story that was set in the mountains in Greece. Plato writes about this in the Republic. So there's a shepherd. He has his flock, and all of a sudden in this mountain he sees a crevasse. He goes down and slides down this tunnel, and at the bottom there is a treasure. On a skeleton he finds a ring, and he throws the ring on his own finger, turns it, and he is invisible. Okay? Now once he's invisible, things begin to happen. But wait, before he found the ring, it's not as though he was an especially immoral guy. The correlational studies that Dr. Shermer and others might cite about this would put this shepherd, his name is Gyges, in the moral camp. He didn't do anything that bad. He didn't murder anybody. But he's not necessarily moral. The ring is not what makes him moral or immoral. Maybe he was immoral before that. What happens when he gets the ring is he rapes the queen, kills the king, and takes the hell over. Now, in this situation, what have we learned? The reason Plato starts with this profound story, and by the way, if I have a minute for a soapbox, I'll hop right on there and tell you why the Lord of the Rings messes this up entirely. Still bothers me. But the reason Plato starts the story with this is because he's being challenged. Look, Glaucon, Thrasymachus, these characters with great proper names say, Plato, there is no morality. There's no all you are, you're watched and you're obedient. You give socially desirable responses, but there's no real morality because as soon as you're away from other people's watchful eyes, you're going to do what you want to do. And that's what Gyges does in this story. That's what maybe we do. But notice, here's the bigger picture and the bigger challenge to this question about does science explain morality? When we look at broad correlational population-level studies to show these relationships, we're missing the point that there's a big confound. In modern secular societies, let's play spot the CCTV cameras, okay? So we are surrounded by cameras. We're carrying our phones around. We're being watched through our phones. How many people in here put tape over their camera on their okay, I didn't need hands, but yes, many people do. Many people are whether you're skeptical about the government or you're just afraid someone is watching you, being watched has never been, to be a watcher of people has never been better. But that doesn't mean that the reason that you're not going to steal the purse of the person sitting next to you is because you're a 100% moral person. I really believe in you folks. We're right here at Cal State Fullerton. Of course, you're good folks. But on the other hand, you might have selfish motivations for some of that, right? You might not want to go to jail for the rest of your life. Don't confuse that selfish motivation with being moral. To be really moral, is not to look at that kind of correlational data. It's to look at individual relationships. How does this? What are the internal states? And Dr. Shermer was gesturing at that in the latter part of his comments. I think that's really important. But notice here now we're talking about altruists, and we already saw some methodological problems with altruism earlier. So there are a couple studies about this. The John Templeton Foundation funded a study. Well, one of them ended up showing that religious kids were in fact John Desati from University of Chicago, I believe, was showing that religious kids are actually more selfish and less altruistic. But other studies were looking at moral heroes, people who sacrifice their lives for other people. You know, the guy in the subway who jumps down there to save the kid who fell in right before the train's approaching. Studying those people are great ways science can reach this question, does it explain morality? But until we understand their profoundly unusual motivations, it hasn't.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being not having to get tackled for going over time. That's awesome. So now we're going to start the 15-minute period between all of you, gentlemen, and I'm going to have to, since we have one man down over here in the form of a microphone, we are going to make do. And there you go.
Thanks.
15 minutes.
So you're going to interact with one another, take on each other's positions, and I think Dr. Shermer, you want to go first since you were first, kind of take on
sure.
points
So,
that you heard?
I think we still have a dead battery.
It may time out. You might have to.
Oh, I can reboot. There we go. Okay, we're good. All right, so I'll just initially just make a few comments to each of the gentlemen's opening statements. I think Ryan, I was not aware the Heinrich study had been critiqued, but I know it's been replicated, and similar results, percentages of generosity and so on, have been found. In any case, I think the ultimatum game is a better paradigm than the dictator game. The ultimatum game, there's an exchange between two people, and they can build up trust or build up a relationship or build up some kind of moral feelings, like this person was generous to me, so I'll be generous back to them, which is, I think, a better match of how the real world works in terms of what even constitutes something that's moral. If you're by yourself just throwing coins out without any consequences one way or the other, that's not really a moral issue. That's why I don't like the dictator game that much. In any case, what those studies show, I think, is that we have a capacity for moral emotions, for moral generosity, and so on. Those are the better angels. And we also have the inner demons, in Pinker's apt metaphor. The whole point of a civil society is to tilt the incentives, to bring out, to accentuate the better angels and attenuate the inner demons. And we have a pretty good idea of how to do that, like being watched. Knowing that you're going to be watched or judged or something, you become more moral. And it's not that that's some kind of artificial thing. The propensity to be moral is in there, and the tilting the incentives through laws, tax programs and incentives to be more generous by giving you a tax break, those sorts of things, we've figured out, the so-called choice architecture, really works. But it wouldn't work if we weren't naturally inborn, innate, really moral beings. None of those things would work. And so the whole point of a civil society is to create a choice architecture that makes us more moral. Now, what do I mean by more moral? That's the question on the table tonight. What's the metric we're using? And I think the great moral philosophers have figured this out. It's basically the principle of interchangeable perspectives, that I can't claim that I have a special position in the universe just because I happen to be sitting in the most important chair in the universe because I'm sitting in it, and expect you to take me seriously. I have to appeal to you and your values and what you care about to get you to care about me. And this is the basis of Hobbes's and Locke's social contract, of Kant's categorical imperative, of the expanding moral sphere, moral circle, Peter Singer, and Spinoza's view from nowhere. It's John Rawls' original position. You don't know which position you're going to be in society, so you have to design a law that covers everybody, because you might be in one category or the other. So, and that's of course the golden rule. I think that has been discovered over and over and over again because it's really there. In the same way that Kepler could not discover anything but elliptical orbits, philosophers and scientists would inevitably discover that this principle of interchangeable perspectives, the golden rule, whatever you want to call it, is really there, really there. It's not out there like the mass of a particle. It's in here. Anyway, so that's my thoughts on that.
Okay. May I interject?
You go ahead, and then I'll.
Well, so in your book you mentioned ethical theories usually have two parts: a theory of obligation and a theory of values. And Dr. Shermer mentions in his book natural rights theory and consequentialism as theories of obligation, and also Peter Singer comes up there too. But to say that it's really there is I find awkward, or maybe I don't understand that. I mean, I think Doug was voicing this point that nature has no moral value intrinsically, and if it does, we might attribute it moral value, but it's not there. So if you believe that people have natural rights, but if I get out my rights-o-meter, beep 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 beep, there is no such thing. We don't have one, and I can't imagine science proving that people have natural rights. That seems strange to me.
Well, you could ask the affected person. Ask an African American, do you want to be enslaved? They'll tell you. So, what did you just measure there? Is it just some opinion? Well, in my opinion, is it?
Right. Maybe I'll flip it over to Doug, because I think your point applies right here. It is just an opinion.
Really? You cannot say slavery is really wrong. All you can say is it's just my opinion that it's wrong. Somebody else may think it's great, and we're all equal.
No, sorry. I think you're misunderstanding me. Your thesis was that science explains morality. And I completely agree that slavery is wrong. But
Why?
You're
But why?
suggesting,
Wait, why? Why is it wrong?
You're suggesting that science is explaining morality. And I'm asking you, how does science show that slavery is wrong? And all you're telling me is, look, go read Rawls or look at Peter Singer or talk about natural rights. Those aren't scientific arguments. That has nothing to do with science. But your thesis is science explains morality.
Mention,
We have a problem there.
as a researcher in moral judgment, I'd like to just emphasize that no one doing research on moral judgment makes a claim that they're finding out what really is the right or the wrong thing to do. They're just describing the kinds of moral judgments people make when facing complex dilemmas. Often these are studied in the context of, would you kill one person to save the lives of a number of other people? And no researcher is saying, this is the right thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do. They're just describing the factors that influence people's judgments. On the question of morality in nature, the only way out of the is-ought problem is up. There has to be something beyond nature to give it moral force. There has to be some intention placed before is in order for is to have any moral value. And a starting point would be recent findings that all life forms that have evolved over the last 4 billion years originated from one type of cell. It's referred to as LUCA, L-U-C-A, the last universal common ancestor. And it is established through genetic analyses. And it comes very close to what Darwin referred to as life originating from some one primordial form. If you look at the evidence that this original population of cells that gave rise to all subsequent life forms was willed, was intended, the evidence is quite strong. I outline it in my articles in Skeptic, but basically chemists have yet to show that they can create a living cell from something that is not already alive. A fundamental principle of biology is biogenesis. Life comes from life. And it's just an assumption that biologists typically make, that the first cell came from a random combination of organic compounds. So let's just consider the implication. If that first population of cells, LUCA, last universal common ancestor, was intended, then it was also intended that life forms grow, diversify, fulfill their potential. That would be an objective moral good. And it's also a fundamental principle in humanistic theories. It's most commonly known in the context of Carl Rogers' theories, humanistic theories and his approach to therapy, person-centered therapy.
Can I ask you a question at this point?
Yeah.
Is that okay? I don't want to interrupt, but we only have 5 left.
Yeah.
So you said that if we found a last common ancestor was the product of an intention of a supernatural or non-human agent, then it would lead to moral outcomes. We would know that certain things were better or worse, or right or wrong.
Right.
Why? I mean,
because it was.
Let me set that question up, if I may.
Yeah.
So we many people believe in all kinds of different gods, but what use is that? I mean, so. To go back to ancient Greece and Plato, right? Polytheism. The gods have very different views about what is right and wrong. They're fighting with one another. Why? And even if we shift to monotheism, which was a big deal in the development of a unitary moral theory, that doesn't help us because we know that God changes his mind. So why on earth would you conclude that if there's a universal ancestor caused by a deity, then from it follows that there is morality, especially since that deity has led to all kinds of. I mean, evolution is the worst thing ever, right? Because it kills all kinds of people and does so terribly.
Right. Now we have to distinguish between natural processes that were intended and natural processes that were not intended. And analyzing intent in terms of this first population of cells helps us make this distinction. What aspects of that initial life form have persisted?
But Doug, I think you made my point in your statement that these first cells have intention built into them. That's what natural selection does. These self-replicating molecules have an intention. It's their purpose. Like the purpose of a star is to convert hydrogen into helium. That's its goal in life. And so we can scale up from there. And let me address, you brought up the trolley problem. I will say what the right answer is, even though most moral philosophers that study this don't. So the trolley problem. It's going to kill the 5 workers unless you divert it down the track and it kills the 1 worker. Okay, so almost everybody says, yeah, I would divert it. And if you change it where you have to shove the guy off a bridge to stop the trolley, less people do it because it's more visceral. Okay, so that has implications for our moral intention and how involved we are. But if we change the dynamic and say, okay, so a doctor has 5 dying patients in 5 ORs and he has 1 healthy patient in the waiting room, would you agree that it's okay for him to kill the 1 healthy patient to save the 5 patients? No, and if you did, you'd be convicted for murder, because we don't want to live in a society where at any moment you walking down the street can be plucked out and murdered just because somebody's decided that you can save 5 people. We have, over the course of several centuries, decided that the autonomy of the individual trumps the group benefits. And the reason for that is because this is what leads to genocide. That if it's okay to kill 1 to save 5, you can kill 1 million to save 5 million, and so forth. And we don't want to live in that society. It's not a healthy society, as judged by this moral foundation, where we start.
Let's take it back to so this goes back to my criticism. So you say in your book, quote, "Reason and the principle of interchangeable perspectives puts morals on a par with scientific discoveries than cultural conventions." But even in that case, so maybe 80, 90 people out of 100 would agree with you. Let's not kill the living to bring back someone who's on the verge of death. But how does science prove that? That's the leg in your argument. I just
like to say that.
Let me unpack that a little bit. When I use the word science, I also mean reason and philosophy. I'm not one of these scientists that says philosophy is dead. Philosophy is the foundation of all of science. It's underneath it all. Or the umbrella over it, whatever. So it's all in the same package. And then I also consider the social sciences and the moral sciences to be sciences. No less, actually, even harder than the physical sciences, because there's more variables to study. And that one of the things we've been doing for centuries is running experiments. We have every time the Supreme Court has a decision, that's an experiment. We see what happens. Every gun control law in all 50 different states have 50 different gun control laws. Those are 50 experiments. We can decide which ones we want to go in which direction. Now, these are not always easy. The abortion issue you brought up is probably one of the hardest ones. But there we've been moving in more and more the direction of the sentience argument. That is, more and more people in the Western world think that abortion should be illegal, after 3 months, because by then the cortex is largely in place and so forth. So there's some presumption of sentience. So our law has been moving more and more in that direction, as it has with the difference between the shooter and the hurricane. Mens rea, what's in the mind of the hurricane? It doesn't have a mind.
Okay, so just to interject real quick.
Can I just say that all this discussion, we're still in the land of is, and we're trapped. What people do or feel or say is still just describing natural phenomena, and the only way out is up.
I was just going to point out. Now I'm quite confused about the scope of science. When you're talking about science, you're referring to so many things that are not using the scientific method. I never thought that sitting in my office reading philosophy was science. That really changes.
You should broaden your thinking on this matter.
Yeah. Or you could be more clear. Here you go.
Well, okay. So let's take an example. Jared Diamond's work, Guns, Germs, and Steel. he wants to answer the question, why are there differential rates of development of civilizations around the globe over the last 13,000 years? You can't run any experiments. There's no lab we can do. It's called the comparative method. It's already happened. So we look to see what's already happened and analyze the data and compare across. So my favorite simple example, compare North and South Korea. They started exactly the same politically and economically in the 1950s. Now they're hugely different. Why? We can study exactly which variables make a difference. What economic systems, political systems, and so on, which laws work, which laws don't work, and so on. We know as social scientists. That's science.
Okay, we're going over time, but
Do
great. Well, again, the quote here is, reason and the principle of interchangeable perspectives puts morals more on a par with scientific discoveries than cultural conventions. But what you just said 5 minutes ago was, in effect, science does include cultural conventions. It includes cultural conventions like what moral philosophers think about and what other people here do and so on. So now what that really reads is, reason and the principle of interchangeable perspectives puts morals on a par with cultural conventions and cultural conventions, because science for you doesn't require the use of the scientific method. That seems to be a big problem. I mean, it certainly is for me.
It depends how you define the scientific method. Okay, so I'm talking about just like gathering.
We might not have enough time for that tonight. It's the audience turn.
This could go on all night. Okay, so I'll start the questions. If you have questions, that's your microphone, not this one. So you can line up, or if you're in the back and you don't want to come up front, you can go around the back there. But I'm going to start. Dr. Navarick, you know I love you. You said nature has no moral content. How would you explain Paul Bloom's research in his book, Just Babies, that they are doing studies with these infants? You got a puppet, you got a good puppet, and you got a puppet that's kind of a dick. And when you demonstrate the dick puppet to the baby has a choice to punish or reward, and invariably, almost every time, the baby punishes the dick puppet. Mm-hmm. So how would that jive with nature has no moral content?
Yeah, it's a moral intuition that has evolved as a way of promoting survival of individuals within groups. You're looking at the products of evolution. Evolution has no moral content to it. It's no basis for morality. It's
Is that a scientific conclusion, though, and not the up that you mentioned earlier?
That's what the babies do is an indication of the effects of evolution, primarily. And there's no moral content to evolution. What are the priorities of evolution? As Richard Dawkins has emphasized, to transmit as much of our genes into future generations as possible. It's a matter of looking out for your own. It has nothing to do with a cosmopolitan Enlightenment humanism. It's about looking after your own. There's nothing more diametrically opposed to humanism than evolution. And that's all you're seeing in the behavior of the babies. What has worked over thousands of years in maintaining the survival of the species.
Anybody else have any?
So we have a line, and I just want to say that Dr. Shermer set you guys up to ask Ryan or Dr. Nichols why slavery is wrong. So I hope that one of you plan to do that. Okay, what is your name?
No pressure.
My name is Maz.
Okay, what's your question?
Okay, so it goes back to the ought and is question, and also evolution and morality, basically, everything. So, so we know after the age of enlightenment that science can tell us that our morality is basically based on evolution, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned the trolley problem. If you just twist that problem a little bit and make that one guy a family member, right? Kin selection, then everything changes. So my question is, if our morality, which is from our biology, is based on upbringing, genetics, and circumstances, and culture, then how can we really hold someone responsible for their wrongdoings?
You mean in terms of like free will and determinism kind of thing?
Right.
Yeah, okay. So, well, I'm a compatibilist. I think we live in a determined universe, of course, but that the choices that we make are part of the causal net, and therefore there are choices. One part of my brain makes one choice, the other part reads it, whatever. But it's still me, it's still my brain. So back to mens rea, and the law has kind of tracked this over the centuries that intention, back to Doug's comment about intention is everything. That is important. That is the difference between the hurricane and the shooter. Now, if it turns out the Vegas shooter, if he didn't blow his brains out, had a tumor in his brain, like Charles Whitman at the University of Texas shooter with the quarter-shaped next to his amygdala, a tumor next to his amygdala, oh, well, okay, that was the cause of it. But there's some other cause like that. But it's still this person making that choice at some level. There's sort of shades of degrees of freedom, as Dan Dennett calls it, that, and the law tracks this. The more degrees of freedom you have, the more we're going to hold you accountable. So, like in the Middle Ages, they used to hold like an axe accountable for killing the dog or whatever, and put the axe on trial. We don't do that because we've developed our scientific thinking about these things. So I think people have to be held morally accountable, absolutely, and you can still do that in a deterministic framework.
Well, can I ask a question? Do you feel that intentions are natural processes?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And therefore can be explained in terms of cause and effect?
Yes, absolutely.
So wouldn't that make intention just as much a natural process as the direction that a hurricane takes?
Except, okay, so here I'm going to quote from your forthcoming article in Skeptic Magazine called... Spoiler alert. His opening epigram for this article is from the great Shakespeare, of course, Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2. Yeah. For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Yeah.
Right, that's my whole point, that we are thinking animals. The difference between us and lions that kill, instrumentally to get food, is that we can think about it. We can have a moral sense. So the intentional moral actions, good or bad, that we can be rewarded for or punished for or held accountable for is part of our evolved nature. It's part of the universe, and I want to talk you into going up without going supernatural.
We're still in the land of is here. You're talking about what we think.
I'm making a transition from is to ought in the sense that, and once we have a moral foundation, then we can determine what we ought to do to get to that goal. Yeah. Now, it's possible I'm wrong and that there's some moral universe where slavery is good and the Holocaust is also good, but I doubt it.
Perfect. I'll tell you what we ought to do is get to another question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Go ahead. What's your name? And
my name's Justin. I'm a CSUF alumni, and Dr. Navarick was actually my advisor. So.
Get in that microphone. Don't be afraid.
My question is primarily for Dr. Shermer, because I still think that there's a meta-ethical question here. What is morality and what is good? That needs to be clarified. So if we're deriving morality from within, I think we could all intuit that killing others is wrong. And we can come up with an experiment. For example, perhaps the death penalty deters crime. So we can actually test this empirically, right? But whether or not the death penalty is morally good or morally wrong is still an open question, regardless of what that evidence shows. So I'm just curious, how can science answer questions like that, which I think are a little bit more difficult? So, how can science answer?
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, death penalty, abortion. I mean, these are hard issues, and I've changed my mind on these. I used to be in favor of the death penalty, mainly in sympathy with the victims' families. And when you read about what some of these guys did, the people on death row, you can read what they did. It's like just fire up old Sparky and fry this guy. I mean, that's what I'd like to do morally, emotionally. I mean, that's my intuition. But in a civil society in which we have sort of this utilitarian goal of maximizing our well-being and flourishing and so on, the death penalty does not help with that. So I've changed my mind on that for several reasons that are not important here. But basically, the state makes too many mistakes. and corrupt police departments, all those kind of practical things. But philosophically, do we want to give the state that much power? Having a rule of law is good to squelch the self-help justice moral module we have, where we want justice and we're going to take it on ourselves. That leads to more violence. So it's good to have a state that says, no, we'll take care of the justice for you. But it can go too far. So I think we can derive something along those lines through reason and science, data, and so on.
All right, next question.
This is a really short mic.
You can take it right out of that stand or lift the stand up, whatever.
Hi, how are you? This is for Dr. Shermer. I really liked your opening statement, but I just don't understand how you could reconcile the statements of biological success of genes replicating and at the same time just opening with absolutes such as slavery is bad, Holocaust is wrong. And the reason I ask that is because you can look at a photograph of Thomas Jefferson's descendants and it seemed like he was very successful with his built-in sex slave and the rape of his wife's half-sister, and it seemed like he passed on an awful lot of genes, and that would make him kind of successful, scientifically speaking.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that. Yeah.
But my question is, you're asking us to explain to you why slavery is wrong, and it seems to me like you don't really quite have an answer yourself. And
well, I thought I gave my answer. Why do you think it's wrong?
It's not about me and what I think, but what I'm asking you is...
Well, I'm curious.
I don't think you could scientifically explain why slavery is wrong. And the reason I say that is if I wanted to capture you right now and castrate you and make sure you never have biological offspring ever again. I'm serious.
Talk about a spoiler alert.
If I wanted to do that right now, if I wanted to make sure Dr. Sherman never again passed on a gene, I don't understand how you could explain to me that that's wrong if I just want to make sure only my genes succeed to further generations.
Okay. A couple things. First, let's let Jefferson off the hook a little bit. Judging
why?
Him
Why should we let him off the hook?
By modern standards. First of all,
why?
Huh?
But actually, no. The reason I'm saying that, I don't mean to interrupt.
Topic.
No, but hold on. But the reason I'm saying we should not, because it is actually a great experiment. It's what you want. You want those historic experiments. You want us to analyze history, right? Because we can't run a slavery experiment for Dr. Shermer, right? So we have to look at history. We have to look at what has happened. Why should we let him off the hook? I don't understand that. Explain to me why he is not successful scientifically with having passed on so many genes.
Well, first of all, it appears by all accounts that he had a loving relationship with the woman.
So he's successful?
Huh?
So he's successful?
Okay. I'm not going to judge Jefferson whether he's successful
why
or not.
not? I don't understand.
think his principles that he laid down 2.5 centuries ago have led us to much moral progress, even if many of the founders were rather hypocritical in their statements that all men are born equal except for African American men and so forth. But we're judging them by today's standards, and that's the point. Today's standards are better. We've gotten better at discovering things that make flourishing and survival and flourishing of more people in more places, and that's the expanding moral sphere. So.
But how would you scientifically explain away my desire to enslave you right now? How would you actually?
Well,
how would you actually
the principle of
convince me not
interchangeable
to?
perspectives. Just as you would not want me to enslave you, I don't want you to enslave me.
But
so
that has
I don't
nothing-
want to live in a society
Okay.
where you could do that to me because I don't want to do that to you and vice versa. That's the principle of interchangeable perspectives.
So that is literally your explanation of why slavery is wrong.
Yes.
Just because you don't want to be enslaved.
And you don't want me to enslave you.
Well, you don't
either.
know that. But that's the interesting thing. You actually
Okay.
don't know that.
on,
No, but I'm
okay.
serious. But you actually have
I'm
no way
pretty
of knowing
confident that most people would not want to be enslaved.
Why do you think that?
You
That-
can just ask them.
But
They will tell you.
I asked you, and your only response is that because you believe I don't want to be enslaved.
I think we're going to have
No,
to get to the
because
next
I don't
question.
want to be
Excuse me.
either.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, the golden rule is an awfully strange rule for this very reason. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. So if you do like S&M, then you want that done to. So you should do that to other people. No, the golden rule is.
Well, you ask
pardon
first.
Me, but, that's not the right moral principle for us to work. I just wanted to get us to the next question, though. So please go right ahead.
I have a question that kind of touches on Dr. Nichols' last point for you, Dr. Shermer. In this,
You got juked.
in this era of misinformation and fake news, I'm just wondering how you can verify what information or evidence can justify your scientific validation of morality. When we loosen that definition, doesn't any evidence justify any type of morality? Don't we need that scientific method to kind of serve as at least a base guideline for
I
how
think
we
so.
can verify
you
evidence?
Can you give me an example?
I mean, you can do a Google search and find scientific evidence proving to you that the world is flat.
I
but
see.
we know for a
Okay.
fact
All
that
right.
that is not
Yes,
true.
yes, yes.
So
I
we
see.
need
I
some
see.
kind of
Yes.
some kind of meter here.
Yes, I think the idea of scientific consensus is a good idea. Because yes, of course, online you can find any goofy thing, but note, like on that particular matter of consensus, it's not a democracy. Climate scientists just don't get together in a room like this and vote and see how everybody feels about the climate. You know, the consensus is the counting up of the number of papers whose conclusion was that global warming is real and human caused. That's what we mean by consensus, not that we're voting on it. Yeah.
If I may follow up on
Yeah.
that matter, do we have scientific consensus that science proves morality exists, or that science can prove a certain type of morality one way or another?
Well, I'd say some of us are working on it. Again, people like myself, Pinker, Sam Harris, we're in the minority for sure. And I'm not talking about religious, the divine command theory. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about secular philosophers and scientists who mostly agree with you and with Ryan and Doug.
Thank you for your question. Next, what is your name and what is your question?
My name's Omar.
You want to get in the mic.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. First, I got distracted by the previous question because, like, the Earth being flat, that wouldn't be scientific evidence because under peer review that wouldn't hold up using basic math. Anyway,
Thank you for that. No, seriously.
do you feel like, because you keep talking about nature doesn't show morality or like the golden rule and stuff, it seems to me like a lot of what we call moral behavior would just be explained by empathy, human empathy, and like if you look at instances like the Christmas truce of World War I, where once people on both sides talked to each other and the enemy was humanized, they didn't want to kill each other anymore. But the previous day, they wanted to kill each other. So it seems like a lot of our moral choices and moral behavior is tied to empathy and how we view other people, and if we view them as people, how our opinion of them.
Yeah. On this, I would recommend Paul Bloom's latest book, Against Empathy. Not that he doesn't like it. It's just that there's a dark side to empathy. The more empathetic you are to your fellow in-group members, if you're threatened by an out-group, the more violent you will be toward the out-group because you are so bonded with your fellow group members.
But that doesn't sound like empathy. That's like to me that sounds like a separate thing where you can, if you really were empathetic, even if it's another group, you wouldn't necessarily view them as another group because you'd still view them as people. But the fact that you don't view them as people shows that you're not, empathetic enough to actually say that. You just say, okay, these are the others, and then their, actions and behaviors to them or to you are just others.
Yeah, so expanding the moral sphere is to include more and more people as honorary friends and family and group members, so you don't want to kill them. And that's what we've been doing for centuries. Not willy-nilly, in a very directional, progressive way, in which you can actually track the progress that we have. So I think if you want to think about empathy that way, expanding moral sphere to include more people that we're empathetic toward in the good way, then yes, I would agree. The empathy is part of morality.
What I mean is, so we have empathy. Empathy is a human trait, and stuff like expanding the moral sphere, to me, that's separate from empathy in the sense that that's more related to, like, for instance, now we have more technology. We can contact people across the world. The world, thanks to freedom of information, the world, it seems a lot smaller, and it's a lot easier to empathize with different people than it was back in like the medieval ages and stuff. But do you feel like maybe empathy, since it's already built into us, that's the driving force behind our moral behavior, and then the fact that the moral sphere gets expanded, that's just related to
empathy
the society we're in.
is just one of the tools. Reason is another one. We can reason our way to figuring out what's the right thing to do, and we do this all the time.
All right, next question. And going forward, we're going to keep it to one question. All right.
Well, we're just running out of.
Yeah. What is your name and what is your question?
My name is Nicholas.
Get in that mic, Nicholas.
Yes. Dr. Navarick, you said that the only way to get out of the is-ought problem is up. What might self-replicating androids with sophisticated artificial intelligence conclude about their own morality 10,000 years from now when they're sitting on the stage and we're all long gone?
Our overlords.
Thank you.
They're machines, is what they would conclude, just like us, except for the added dimension that the evidence indicates that we have a non-material origin. The androids have a material origin. The evidence indicates that life was willed. The initial cells were willed. And those initial cells then grew and evolved and diversified into the countless life forms that have developed over the last 4 billion years. That would be the fundamental distinction between android machines and human machines. Evolution in itself is a mechanical process, but the evidence points to an intention behind evolution. It's a very efficient way of creating what Darwin referred to as endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful. So we are, the evidence indicates, the products of that original intention. And the androids could never make that claim.
Awesome. Next question.
Hello, my name is Scotty. I just wanted to say that I think that it's great that we can debate these issues in public and in peace. I think that we're actively taking part in moving our moral intuitions forward. Having said that, I do have a question about the grounding morality in evolution and biology. With the advent of gene editing techniques like CRISPR-Cas9 and kind of the resurgence of Lamarckian evolution with the based on epigenetics, right? It seems plausible that we could have basically an infinite amount of different biological organisms that could have different biologically based moral intuitions. And if they do, then doesn't that kind of discount what you were suggesting as far as having moral values be these ontologically objective kind of objects? And that's kind of it. Thank you.
Yeah, boy. Okay, so yeah, could we engineer in morals? Yes, I think we could in that sense if we figured out what the genomic sequence was related to moral behavior. So, for example, we know the prefrontal cortex is deeply involved in self-control of impulses that are bubbling up from the amygdala, for example, in the limbic system, and that people that have a low-functioning prefrontal cortex are more violent. They act out on their impulses where you and I count to 10 before we act out and do something stupid. If we knew what the cause was of some people to develop their prefrontal cortex more than others and there was some genetic related not to that instead of brain damage or whatever, then yeah, we should do that. Well,
Thank you.
I know, that's crazy. But
next question.
Bring it on.
Hi, I'm Amanda. Dr. Navarick, I have a question for you. You talked a lot about intention behind light.
Get right in that microphone.
You talk a lot about intention behind light and behind evolution. It sounds to me, as a theistic evolutionist, are you referring to some kind of deity, or who or what intended all those things to happen?
In Skeptic a couple of years ago, in several articles, I developed a construct of a god with a minimalist construct with just the essential features, that it's non-material, it's creative, and it has intention, without any religious ideologies going along with it. And with just those minimal properties that can be tested in ways that I discuss in those articles. we can make tremendous moral progress. It opens doors. Once you acknowledge the possibility that life was willed, you can ask what natural processes that flowed from those original life forms were intended. So over the billions of years since that event, life forms have diversified and grown. And just from that fact, you can support a fundamental principle of humanistic theory. It's the form of self-actualization that Carl Rogers wrote about, which is the basis of person-centered therapy, which he got from the psychiatrist and neuropsychologist Kurt Goldstein in the 1930s in his book, The Organism, where Goldstein said, the tendency to actualize as much as possible the organism's individual capacities and the only drive by which the life of an organism is determined. In other words, the same drive that forces a weed up through a crack in the sidewalk drives us to become the kind of person we feel we were intended to be. There is intent behind this universal feeling that we need to become who we feel we really are, to exercise our capacities. But it has nothing to do with sentience specifically. That's just our reaction.
But Doug, why can't that just be built into the laws of nature? And even if we don't know what the source of the laws of nature are, that they're just built in a certain way that stars do what they do, mountains do what they do, animals do what they do. The intention is built into the laws of nature, and we'll just stop right there at the epistemological wall and say we don't know what the source of the laws of nature are that lead to progress or non-zero games or whatever.
Because the laws of nature have no purpose. Evolution has no vision of the future. It's just a mechanical process. What gives natural law, moral authority is the intention behind it. As Jefferson wrote, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. He didn't say we are endowed by natural laws with these rights. And in the case of self-actualization, you can deduce applications. Why is slavery wrong? Objectively speaking, because it denies individuals the opportunity to grow and become who they have the potential to be. That's an objective basis for arguing that slavery is morally wrong. It's not what people here or there may say about it.
You're making my point, aren't you?
No, I'm saying that what people feel or say about any issue is still a natural process.
I'm saying next question.
Well, yeah, we're running short here, and we want to meter it out pretty well. So what's your name and what's your question for whom?
Adriana, I am a alumni, and my question is for Dr. Shermer. Nichols brought up the fact that for morality, there isn't really a meter that says you're more moral than one person or you're less moral than another. And you compared the cell and biology example in regards to DNA and the way in which people are innately moral. But how does that really compare? So a cell can be anything from plants or humans or animals that it turns into be, but a cell's job is to grow into something else, and that's their potentiality. But how is a person's job to be moral? How is their potentiality to be moral?
That's a really good question. I think I would give Doug's answer.
You don't agree with him.
Well, I swear he just agreed with me.
But he said it from an objective
he's going
standpoint.
up just one more step than I would go. The laws of nature were granted to us by some willful, intentional, whatever. You don't even need to call it a God, I guess. But I would just stop one step short of that and say it's built in for us to do that, to be self-actualized. Just like the star has to convert hydrogen to helium, we have to do certain things to be self-actualized, and so that leads us to do certain actions that we consider moral or immoral by that standard.
I would say that doesn't make it moral. We're driven by nature to do many things. We eat, we drink, we urinate, we defecate. Those are not moral
Yeah, of
actions.
course. Of course, not everything is moral, right? Yeah, of course.
But you are somewhat saying that they are. So, when based in other cultures where they grow up completely different from the United States, the same thing that we think is moral may not be the same thing that they think is moral.
Well, yes, that's correct. Yeah. So back to my analogy of we're all born with the capacity to learn a language. Which one you learn depends on which culture you're in. So we're all born with the capacity to be moral or immoral. And the particular things you feel guilty about doing or whatever may vary in details from culture to culture, but there's certain universals that are across the board that evolutionary psychologists have been writing about for decades now, that just come up over and over and over in all cultures.
Just like it's universally understood that we have to end at 9. So next question. We're only going to get 2 more questions, very brief answers, and then we're going to go to closing statements. I'm sorry, but go ahead.
Okay, my name is Alex Yu, and I'm nobody. My question is to all you guys. Suppose I need money to support my children to attend USC, okay, and I sell my organs, let's say my kidney or my liver, to a patient in China who need an urgent transplant. So I save a patient. He is happy. I have money to support my children to attend USC. They are happy. That's no victim. Or, let's say a brother and a sister want to have sex. They agree. And they did everything, to avoid having a baby. They're happy. That's no victim. Can you use science, religion, philosophy, whatever, to judge whether this victimless situation is immoral?
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, that's a. Do you want to?
Oh, sorry, I haven't talked in so long. I forgot how. No. Yeah, that's a great example. It comes up in the work of the Jonathan Haidt. So if you're curious about that, you could read some of his work, Haidt. And he shows that he calls it moral dumbfounding. So he goes up and asks people questions like that. If a brother and sister were to have safe sex, is that wrong? And people always say, yuck, that's wrong. And they're challenged by the researchers. He trained these psych researchers to be very philosophical and challenge their pushback. Oh, so you think it's wrong because we might have a kid, but I told you we're having safe sex. The condom might break. No, well, I've got tubes tied. So for every objection, he had an answer, and they couldn't be convinced that it was ever not wrong. Which shows some recalcitrance in our moral faculties, because as you say, that's a victimless crime. Another one that always gets the laugh is masturbating into a chicken, but you'll have to see his book for that one. So I take it your question is, how can science prove that that's wrong? And that's a great question. It doesn't seem to prove that it's wrong, but it's at the same time. We universally have these intuitions that is extremely wrong. So for those who think that science can explain morality, that is another very tough nut to crack.
All right, thank you.
I'm going to get right up on the mic here and apologize. I'm not the best with names. So stage left, right here. I'm very curious about the poker chip dollar bill study you mentioned earlier. It seems the overwhelming majority of people will behave a little bit more selfishly, amorally when nobody's watching, but when they know they're being experimented on, when they know they're being watched, maybe they'll adapt, behave a little bit more altruistically. Was there any evidence to the contrary, and is there anything to be learned from these sort of outlier situations?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, thanks for that. So when people are being watched, they behave much more in the way that you would expect them to behave. So their responses are socially desirable, but we have to think further as to whether or not their responses are moral. Now, in much of the evidence in Dr. Shermer's book, those kinds of responses are regarded as moral. If someone does something that's socially desirable because other people are watching, and it's therefore in their self-interest to do that thing, that's regarded as moral. And I want to suggest, given the Ring of Gaiji story, if you remember, that it's morality light. It's certainly not bad, but it doesn't get us to the heart of morality. So so you asked about other studies that might be relevant for this, and there have been a number of them. So one that's got lots and lots of citations is a very simple eye spot study. So at a college, 1 week, people were asked to pay as much as you wanted for getting your own coffee and muffins. They tally up how much people paid. And the next week, everything is the same, except on the bucket where people put their money, there were 2 eye spots. And it turns out that there was a very significant increase in the amount of money people paid for self-paid for their coffee and muffins, which is an indication that being watched is probably a significantly better predictor of people's behavior than is anything about their internal moral states. Did I get that question right? I think, okay.
Awesome. All right. So now, final statements. 3 minutes each. Wait for our guru of time. Ryan?
Okay, thanks. All right. So first point, if we're talking about, why is slavery wrong? You challenged me to answer that, and that wasn't asked, but I can't look like an ass. So slavery is obviously wrong. If you're an adherent of any moral theory, it's going to be wrong. The consequentialist would say that it's wrong because it creates massive amounts of pain and suffering for lots and lots of people. So it's kind of a non-question. As that came up, it came up in the context of how science proves it wrong. As I quoted from Dr. Shermer's book, the suggestion here is that science is on a par, morality is on a par with science, insofar as just as Galileo might prove something about the motions of the moons of Jupiter, so science proves that certain behaviors are immoral. Does it? So I want to conclude by suggesting that we haven't heard great evidence to think that science does that. Science does not successfully prove that certain things are immoral. And this is one way that it doesn't. But the big challenge looking forward to being more positive about it, what do we know about people who are heroically altruistic? These are the people who are capital M moral. They're not moral light. They're not the people who are self-interestedly not stealing from a neighbor because they're going to get caught and go to jail. These are the people who are sacrificing their lives for other people. That's the pinnacle of morality. And these are the people we should aspire to be. And we don't know what does that. In fact, the big challenge for those who advocate that science can explain morality is tackling what's going on there. We know about kin selection. So when one animal sacrifices itself for its kin, say you're a belding squirrel and you see a bird of prey above, well, we know from several studies that the most likely time when a belding squirrel is going to make that warning call is when its kin are present. If it sees the bird of prey and its non-kin are present, it does not make that warning call. That's kin selection. So here we have a case of their genes predicting what they're going to do. Who are they going to save? They're going to save people who have copies of their genes inside of them. But that's not that moral. That's just, if you see what I mean. What would be moral is when someone sacrifices themselves for someone who's totally unrelated. That's what we would like to study. But notice, that defies all kinds of evolutionary psychological rules. It's not a case of kin selection. You're dying for someone else. It's not a case of reciprocity. You will never you've just scratched their back, but they are never scratching yours because you're dead. So if we want to pose the question in an important way, as if it really matters, in a challenging way, it's this. How does science explain that kind of moral, capital M moral behavior? And to that, we don't have much of an answer. But can science explain why we all maintain our enlightened self-interest and why we're not going to steal from one another here? Of course it can. But that, folks, is like shooting fish in a barrel.
Have my views changed? My original position, I feel, is even more supported by the conversations we've had.
Right in there.
Because most of what we've been talking about are causes and effects, causes of moral judgments, or what we are thinking are moral courses of action, altruism, and so on. And these are all natural processes. They don't get us beyond issues of what is. The only way to break out of this trap of the land of is to find a way up. And historically, this has been accomplished primarily through religious traditions and philosophy. But in my God Construct articles in Skeptic, I outline another path up, a scientific path that adheres to all the standard rigorous strategies and considerations of science. And when you look at evidence bearing on the origin of life, was it random or was it will? It clearly points at this stage in the direction of a willed origin. That has revolutionary implications for our understanding of what is right and wrong. As Ryan pointed out, who's to say whether the creator of the original life form deserves to be respected, whether that is a source of, that is a good moral standard. My view is there's no other moral standard available beyond human judgments. And it's in our interest to understand what was intended. Self-actualization resonates. It's fundamental in humanism. And seeing it as the product of an intention gives it greater moral force. There's a basis for arguing that we need to encourage growth, development, and diversity among all individuals. Rather than suppressing, we need to facilitate the expression of the underlying potential for diversity that exists among us.
I think our feeling is, our sense, like with among so many religious people, is that for there to be real morality, there has to be something outside of us, an Archimedean point from which we can lever in moral principles. And of course, for religious people, this is God. Now, Doug, I realize you're not in that category exactly, but you're kind of deducing that in a way that I think we don't need to go that far. I think it could be a transcendent principle that's outside of you and I as individuals, outside of us as a culture. It's part of what we inherit as part of our species, this moral sense that we have of right and wrong, that you're born with, that Paul Bloom's babies, at 6 weeks, they already have a sense of right and wrong. And so that's the best we can do, short of a God, is that we get this by virtue of being born human. And that's transcendent, because it's not up to me and you. It's sort of the moral relativist position. Anything goes. It's your opinion, my opinion. No. There's something outside of us. Well, it's culture. No. I'm talking about something even outside of culture. That's in our nature. That's as good as I can do. I can give you. There's nothing outside of that. That's it. And I think it's good enough. And I think it's science that gives us that worldview. And again, I guess I should reemphasize what I'm using the word in a very broad sense, in the same sense that the Enlightenment philosophers, Jefferson and Locke and Franklin and Paine, these guys, today they would be scientists. That word didn't exist in their time. They were natural philosophers, but they were doing science in that sense of trying to figure out what's really true. And again, you can discover certain things about how best we should live by this criteria of survival and flourishing of individuals, in the same sense that I don't want to be enslaved. This is what Lincoln's argument was, that I would not be a slave. I do not want to be a slave owner. That's as foundational as it gets, and it works. And it builds from there. Granted, death penalty, abortion, these are hard problems that I'm not saying science by itself some experiment or whatever. But in addition to Rawls and Kant and Hume and Aristotle and so on, let's throw some science in there and see if we can push it even further. And from that, I think we can bend the moral arc of the moral universe even further toward justice. Thank you.
Thank you to Doctors Nichols, Shermer, and Navarick. Now we're going to move outside, and there's free refreshments. Just to let you guys know, Dr. Shermer's book, The Moral Arc, will be on sale, and proceeds for that purchase will be donated to Cal State Fullerton's Student Assistance Fund for Emergencies, Project SAFE. So don't congratulate yourself too much on the donation, because you are going to get something out of it. And I think you have a...
Yeah, and then the other thing is, if there's something that you missed or you didn't hear quite right, if you're texting to your grandma about something really great, this audio is going to be available, shameless plug, here on my podcast, I Doubt It with Dollemore, with Brittany. And then also I'm going to put it on my YouTube channel. Just search my dumb name, Jesse Dollemore, and you'll find it. So we'll be out there very, very soon. Thank you guys for coming. We appreciate you very, very much.
Thank you.